Coffee. We are in the final week of a series of messages that we have called Believing Despite Who. And we've been talking about those things that challenge us about people. And people especially who call themselves Christians. Things that we have run into, circumstances we have had with people that we would call difficult, especially if you're here and you're an outsider, or you would say, I'm not really a part of the church. A lot of people say, I really like your Jesus, but I don't like your Christians. My wife has a book that's been on our bookshelf for years, for example, and the title says it this way, if you'd throw it up on the screen. It says, go ahead and throw that up on the screen. It says, I'm fine with God, but it's Christians that I can't stand. And that's how a lot of people have felt. By the way, that is a book that you can still get on Amazon. It is a fun little read. But we have talked about things like hypocrisy and judgmentalism. We've talked about a lack of compassion. We've talked about exclusive truth. And if you remember, every week we've said it really doesn't do us any good to say, well, just forget the church and just love Jesus. And that doesn't do us any good because Jesus invented the church. It would be better to ask, what did Jesus create the church to be? And then you try and be that, or I try and be that. We together try and be that. You know what I think it's like? The church is Jesus's masterpiece, and it's like here over the centuries, there have been people that have painted on Jesus's masterpiece all these different pictures. And what we need to do is we need to scratch through that old paint and get to the original drawing. You see what we're saying here? That's what God wants us to do. And so today, I want to talk to you about what I would call blind faith. What I would call blind faith, because the scenario goes like this. Well, you Christians, you don't even know what you believe. Or you believe it, but you can't really explain why, and your faith is blind. And so people would characterize Christians often as this. Now, the psalm that we just read is all about the search for something bigger than us. The psalm that we read is about the search for transcendent, or the thirst for it, transcendence, the craving that we have, that every human heart experiences. It was way back in the 1600s that mathematician and physicist Blaise Pascal, he put it this way. It's really interesting. He talked about the human craving. And he said, the origins of this thing within us, this craving, it must have something to do with how we're made. And so here's a quote by him, and I just throw it up on the screen so that you could read it. He said, what else does this craving proclaim but that there was once in man a true happiness, of which all that now remains is an empty print and trace. This he tries in vain to fill with everything around him. Now, what is it that Pascal was talking about? I think he's talking about what I would call the search that we all have. And by the way, if you try and deny that all human persons are looking for something more than themselves, you know what it's like? It's like trying to put a cork in Old Faithful. Who knows what Old Faithful is? And what happens, by the way, when you put a cork in Old Faithful? Well, you put a cork in Old Faithful. How many of you know that's not the last you've heard of Old Faithful? What's it gonna do? It's gonna erupt in all sorts of other ways. In fact, it's gonna come out in crazy places, maybe even in violent ways. Now, friends, listen to me. If you and I don't understand this insight of the human need, we are not gonna be able to understand people in our culture. And we're not gonna be able to understand ourselves or what's happening in the world. The reality is, people are searching. Now, for example, right here in this psalm, right at verse 1, there's a typical Hebrew redundancy that you see often in Scripture. When he says, oh God, you are my God, earnestly I seek you. He says, my soul what? Come on, my soul thirsts for you. My body what? There's the redundancy. My soul thirsts, my body longs in a dry and weary land where there is no water. What is he trying to say? He's trying to say, look, there is a hunger. He's saying, my entire being cries out for, and this hunger is just as primal, it is just as elemental as my body's need for water. It thirsts for him. It hungers, my body longs. Now, have you ever been in a situation where you were deprived of water for a really long time? Anybody ever been in that? If you've been in that kind of a situation, you know what happens. Well, psychologically, you start to see water everywhere, don't you? You see mirages and you see hallucinations. And what you'll do if you're in that kind of a state is you will start to grab hold of all sorts of things to quench your thirst, things you would have never touched before, things that you should not put in your body. Why? Because of that desperate need. Now that's what happens. And this is one of the things that he was getting at. Now, what is the psalmist then trying to say? Well, I'd probably put it this way, if you just want to write this down. Here's the way Shane would put it. I would say that all human persons have an irreducible need for something beyond themselves. All human persons have an irreducible need for something beyond us. And by the way, humans will do almost anything to get it. In fact, humans are unlike all the other animals who need nothing further for their thriving. Listen, if I take human beings, and even if all your needs are catered to, this is what we see in North America for the most part. All of the physical needs met, all of the biological needs met. Let's say your social needs are met, your cultural needs are met. I'm telling you, there is still a restless drive in people for something more, unlike any other animal. Now, enter this thing that we call faith. Why? Well, here's why. Here's why faith becomes so important, whether you want to call it faith or not, because it leads to the next reality that all human persons have to wrestle with. Listen, you have to wrestle with it, I have to wrestle with it, and that is this. Write this down. There are needs of our heart, of human people's hearts, that the observable sciences cannot answer. Write that down. There are needs of our hearts that the observable sciences can't answer. In fact, this is a fascinating study. I love history. I wouldn't claim to be a historian. I'm a practice historian or a fake historian, meaning I do have a history degree and I try and read a lot because I love the topic so much, but I've not gone on for any graduate level kind of stuff. But you study this, and most of the experts will tell you if you study this, we are in a culture where people used to say that science would advance and technology would advance to the degree that religion is going to diminish or spiritualism is going to diminish. Guess what? What's happened in society? The exact opposite. Experts note that with all of our advances in technology, it's actually gotten stronger. Now listen, I challenge you just to research the stats on this. There is not an anthropologist, there is not a sociologist, there is not a psychologist who has studied this that would disagree with what I just said. Now, they don't understand it, but they're realizing there really is an incredible hunger in the human race. Guys, go to Barnes & Noble. I go to Barnes & Noble all the time. I'm seeing Barnes & Noble buddies right now that I see there all the time. And I'm there, and so I'm sitting in the coffee shop, and then I go and look around. And while the Christianity section has shrunk, the spiritual section has grown. I mean, you just look at the rows and rows. They call it self-transformation. But let me tell you what these books are on. These books are on reincarnation, the resurrection of witchcraft, paganism, tarot card reading, astral projection, pantheistic meditation, astrology, spirit channeling. Now, everybody said in America at one point, they said, well, that's all gonna die out. Technology's gonna rise, science is gonna rise. But I'm telling you, it is growing as fast as ever. Why? Especially in a culture that Christianity as a niche is declining. Why? It's because there are needs of the human heart that observable sciences can't answer. People are trying to fill something. Now, unfortunately, people think that they either have to go to faith or they have to go to science. Now, you may think that. You're here today and you think, boy, if I'm of faith, I can't be of science, and if I'm of science, I can't be of faith. I just want to say to you, that is so unbelievably not true. You know how many Nobel Prize winners would disagree with you on that point? I think of the movie, for example, one of my favorites, if I'm honest. This shows you how weird I am. Have you seen Nacho Libre? Oh man, Nacho Libre, Academy Award winner, I think. It was amazing. It's about two luchadors that are secretly Catholic priests. If you've not seen this, go watch it, blame me later, okay? But it's about two luchadors that are secretly Catholic priests, and of course, by day they're priests, but by night they're luchador wrestlers. This is what I do on the side, by the way. And they're in their first match, and they're getting ready to go, and one priest says to the other, "Pray to the Lord for strength." And he says, "I do not believe in God, I believe in science." And it's funny because he has this running theme throughout the movie. I can't believe in God, I believe in science. And a lot of people think, well, it has to be one or the other. And I'm telling you again, reality can't be further from the truth. Let me tell you some things about faith and science. Are we ready? I'm gonna tell you some very true things, but I want you to study it on your own and see if you think I'm right. You ready? First point I wanna make to you is that faith, it's not blind. Write that down. Faith is not blind. In fact, I'm gonna define what faith is in a few minutes, but friends, we talked about this. We talked about this in week 3 when we talked about exclusive truth. Our faith is built on or based on revealed and rational evidences that God has provided. That's what our faith is based on. You say, what do you mean? Our faith, unlike any other faith, and this is true, study it, is based in history. You can check it. You can look, you can see, wait, does this line up or not? Now, a person can say, I believe in science, and I wanna say to you, that's wonderful. I love science too, but here's the second part of it I'm gonna say. Faith is not blind, and you've gotta understand, science is not without faith. Let me tell you what's wrong with society. It's not science. I didn't say this in our 8 a.m. service, but the problem is not science, it's what I would call scientism. And scientism is, science is all there is. There's no other disciplines that are out there. And I would say, now that's a problem. But the problem isn't science. Listen, even if you say, well, look, I believe in science alone, meaning what you're saying when you say that is, I believe in the material alone, what you can see, what you can touch. All I'm gonna say to you is, you're gonna have to trust that your worldview accounts for all of reality. Because see, listen, reality is more than what you can touch and what you can see. We're talking about transcendence here today. There are some things that science doesn't answer. I'm reminded, for example, of a debate that I watched several years ago. In fact, I've watched this debate probably almost a dozen times because I love it so much. It was between Richard Dawkins, who is a famous atheist and author, and a guy by the name of John Lennox. And John Lennox actually wasn't supposed to debate him. John Lennox, let me tell you about him. He is a pure mathematician. Was a teacher at Oxford University and then a teacher at Cambridge. He is retired now, he's still alive today. One of the things I love about him though, he was in the final class of C.S. Lewis. And so you look in his history and he tells stories about how C.S. Lewis would come in and lecture, and he has all these great stories that I just love to listen to. But he is a scientist and a pure mathematician. Well, they had this debate on, has science buried God? The guy who was supposed to debate Dawkins, by the way, Dawkins is a very intimidating character because he's written so many books against religion and against God. And so he's supposed to debate, and John Lennox, the guy doesn't show up, and John Lennox says, well, I'll debate him. And so they get in this amazing debate, and it is just so great to watch. I encourage you to go on YouTube, any of you can watch this. They've actually debated 3 times. I've watched all of them. But in this first debate, Dawkins is so frustrated because Lennox keeps calling his belief a faith. And he says, your faith this and your faith that. And Dawkins is becoming increasingly frustrated. Finally, he's just like, look, I'm getting frustrated here because you keep calling it a faith and it's not a faith. And Lennox just looks at him and says, oh, I'm sorry. I thought that you actually believed it. Well, the crowd did exactly what you just did. It's like, oh, and by the way, so did Dawkins. And I'm just gonna say, it's not because I'm a Christian I say this, Lennox wiped the floor with Dawkins. But there is no way around this idea. Listen, your worldview, if you have one, now a person can say, I just choose not to care, that's fine, but you're not gonna wanna go into eternity that way. So your worldview should account for all of reality. Now, it would be good for us to make a really important distinction here, and I want to make it to you because this has really helped me to think about these things. If you just write this down, I'll explain this as quickly as I can. There is a big difference between what I would call inductive sciences and abductive sciences. Write that down. And I want you to remember those words, inductive and abductive. What's the difference? Well, I've put it in your notes. Inductive sciences makes inferences is a conclusion. Inductive sciences makes inferences based on repeatable observations. So this is what you've done in high school when you've gone to biology class. You have done experiments and you've seen a repeated pattern. There was a hypothesis that was made and you observed something happen over and over again and you've said, oh, well, this must be true because I've seen it and you've seen it repeated. Well, that would be inductive. But there's also sciences that are abductive, meaning it draws conclusions based on best explanation. Because, listen, how many know there are some things you can't redo in a laboratory? There are fields of science and topics that cannot be repeated. For example, the creation of the universe can't be repeated. Nothing in history can be repeated. So when you're looking at the bigger truths of the world, in fact, when you're studying fields of astronomy or cosmology, for example, those fields, those can't be done in a laboratory. So they're using what's called abductive sciences. They're saying, based on the evidence, what's the most plausible explanation? Let me give you an example. Everybody ready? I go into my kitchen and I look on the counter and there's peanut butter and jelly bread and there's peanut butter smeared on the counters and the jelly has dripped on the floor. I've got two people in my house, let's say. I've got my wife and I've got my 9-year-old son. I'm looking at the evidence. I didn't witness it. I can't repeat it, but I'm looking at the evidence. Which one of those two do you think made that sandwich? You would say abductively, scientifically, who? Come on. You better not say my wife because she comes to church here. You're gonna assume, what am I gonna immediately say? I'm gonna say, Aiden, what did you do? Right? I'm not gonna go, Melissa, what did you do? Unless I wanna get slapped. Now, that's reasonable. And a lot of science is that way. It's abductive. What has the power of explanation? And by the way, there are some things that, there are truths out there that inductive sciences can't answer. For example, I have some coffee here. Let's imagine this is tea, because I heard it this way from John Lennox, and I just love the illustration. John Lennox says, why do I have a cup of tea? Well, we could go to science. In fact, I did this morning. I Googled it. Why do I have a cup of tea? And let's look at the answer that Google gave me. Are you ready? It said, exposing leaves to oxygen for a period of time determines the color, the taste, the strength of the tea. The longer the leaves, are left there to oxidize, the darker in color and stronger it becomes. Okay, now this is a true answer. This is a right answer. This is a good answer. It is one of the answers. It's telling me how tea is made. But if you asked me, why do I have a cup of tea? It would also be true for me just to say to you, I have a cup of tea because I wanted one. Is one of those answers more true than the other answer? Nope. Both are true. But they're looking at two different parts of the truth. Is everybody with me here? Our faith is not blind, but it is speaking to realities that can't exist on a table or that you can't always measure. In fact, if I could just close it this way, there is a book. I've recommended several books in the series that you pick up. Here's another one to add to your list. Read God's Undertaker by Lennox. It says Science Buried God. I read it a number of years ago. It's very good. He's one of my living heroes. I know I call everybody my hero. He really is. He says, not all science is inductive since we don't have the luxury of repeated observation or experimentation. We cannot repeat the Big Bang, the origin of life, the history of the universe. Indeed, he says, what about any historical event? It's not repeatable. Does that mean we say nothing about these things? There is, however, another methodology that can be applied to such situations. Well known to historians, it is the method of what? What did we call it? Abduction, or inference to the best explanation. So you see what he's saying. So friends, here's what I'd ask you. What is faith? Write this down. Let's define it. Faith is, at its root, trust. Write that down. Faith is trust. Now, friends, listen to me. This is so hard in the Christian church because we use the word faith for so many things. and we accuse one another of not having enough faith. And we have reduced faith in our discussion as Christians to this thing you feel, oh, I just have faith, or you better have enough faith, brother. And we've done ourselves a disservice, because that's really not what faith is. Faith isn't a feeling that I conjure. Faith isn't me working myself up to believe, What's faith at its root? Faith at its root is, first of all, I believe something up here. So for example, I believe in Abraham Lincoln, but it can't stop there. So it has an intellectual part, is that right? But it can't just be intellectual, because I believe in Abraham Lincoln, but that's not helping me with anything, is it? No. So the devil believes in God, but is that helping the devil? No. So it is intellectual, but it has to be more than intellectual. Would everybody agree with me so far? That's why I call it trust. Because when I say I believe in God, there's something more going on there than just my brain or the knowledge of it. Everybody can say they believe in God, but no, when I say I believe, I mean, I really trust something that I don't have all the answers to. And here's what I would say biblical faith is. Faith is trust that has been based on the evidence God has provided. Now, if you'd write that down. Do you want to know why I think people think that Christians have blind faith? It's because Christians have conceded that idea. We don't even know why we believe. We don't even know what the evidence is. Somebody says, why do you have faith? And you go, well, my parents taught me that way. Honestly, the average person, well, I grew up Catholic, especially in our area. I grew up Catholic. It's family tradition. Why do you believe it? Well, because the Bible tells me. What good does that do anyone? Now, I would say the Bible is an evidence, and you could research, that's a whole other series. But why do you believe what you believe? See, biblical faith, what does Paul say in Corinthians? Take a look at this. It's faith based on evidence. Are you ready? Look what he says. He says, let's read it together. And if Christ has not been, our preaching is, and, in other words, what's Paul saying here? He's saying there is a historical event that took place. It was the resurrection. It's so crazy that now we have to believe in Jesus. By the way, that's what happened. They didn't believe. They deserted him at the cross. They all left. Resurrection happens. All of a sudden, people are believing. They shouldn't have believed. They wouldn't have believed. Suddenly, they did believe. This amazing thing took place that changed the world. But Paul's saying, if that didn't happen, we might as well all quit right now. In other words, if there's no evidence, we're in trouble. Y'all following me? We're in trouble. Now, in the Bible, when you talk about evidence, there's a couple types of evidence, and I just categorize it this way. I'm simplifying it, but let me just tell you, there's general evidence and there's special evidence. What's general evidence? Well, general evidence is just look around at creation. The Psalms talk about this all the time. Psalms 8, Lord, O Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. When you have set your glory in the what? In the heavens. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you've set in place. Or I love Psalm 19. Watch this. This is so powerful. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Watch this, verse 2. Day after day, what do? What are they saying? They're saying, God's saying, the heavens say something's there. Something must have made this. Night after night, they reveal knowledge. By the way, the Bible's pro-science. Study it, gaze at it, look at it. Look, they have no speech, it says. They use no words, no sound is heard from them, yet their voice goes out to all the earth, their words to the end of the earth. So you have general evidence. By the way, when the Bible in Romans chapter 1 talks about the wrath of God that's coming upon people on the great day of the Lord, God giving people over to depraved minds and all that stuff, what does he say the evidence is? It's general creation, God's invisible qualities. But then there's special evidence, meaning there are points in history when God has said, look guys, here I am. One of those is the resurrection of the dead. And of course, that's what Paul's talking about. Now guys, all of this is evidence-based faith. It would be better for you when somebody says, why do you believe, for you to pull up Psalm 19 and say, well, just look. The heavens declare the glory of God. The mountain peaks belong to him. The sea is his. Of course, another psalm. The sea is his because he made it. But you get the idea. It would be better to say it makes rational sense. So where does scientific experimentation fail? Well, write these things down real quickly. I'm going to go as fast as I can. Number one, observation can't account for things like morality. But morality exists, doesn't it? What do I mean? Well, look, I have a cup of coffee here. Science can tell me that if I put poison in this coffee and I give it to you to drink, I'm gonna kill you. Is that right? Science will tell me that. But science can't tell me whether or not that's morally right or wrong. Can it? Science can't tell me why it would be right or why it would be wrong. In fact, we've seen in history people do things like kill people because they believed it was morally okay. Well, what tells them it's morally wrong? See, science can't explain what in us creates morals. Example, somebody says, well, I can't believe in God because of all of the evil in the world. Well, if that's you, I just want to ask, from where do you get the moral system to say that something is evil? I can't believe in God because of all the moral evil. Well, how did you come to the fact that there's moral evil? Well, I just think so. Well, what made you to think so? Because see, that is a comprehension and a consciousness that needs to be explained. Where do you get that? Now, a Christian would say, listen to me, my worldview would say morality makes sense because we were created to be moral creatures. That's why Christianity makes sense. That somebody built that into us. Because we talked on judgmentalism, because we are made after a moral God. He is the one who decides what is moral because he is a moral creature. So, by the way, all of the morals that I choose to live by in my life, I check with him because he's my moral standard. I'm not, all this discussion about, well, I was born with this or I was born with that. Guys, it's irrelevant. All that matters is, what is God? What is God? What moral standard does he set? Now listen, that's built into us. It's rational, it makes sense. Or what about, write this down. Scientific observation can't account for the origin of the universe. Can't answer those questions. We've already said, because origin of the universe is not repeatable, so abductively, I just have to say, well, what has the greatest explanatory power? Look, if I can look at the universe and see intelligence, if I could look at the universe and see beauty, doesn't it make sense that there could be intelligence behind it or beauty behind it? Listen, if I told you, I just said to you, look, your computer that you have, it was made by blind, unguided forces. That's who made your computer. Would you trust your computer for anything? No, you wouldn't. But if I say to you, something intelligent must have made that intelligent piece of equipment, you go, oh, well, maybe it's reasonable then. That has explanatory power. See, evidence. If I say to you, the universe, space-time, had a beginning. By the way, science used to tell us that the universe was eternal. So they'd say God doesn't exist because the universe has always existed. But the moment they discovered the Big Bang, scientifically proving that no, we did have a beginning, time had a beginning, a lot of secular scientists didn't even want that known because that gives support to faith. Well, if it had a beginning, then there's a creation. Or it's self-created, but how would you explain that? You guys get the idea. It's reasonable to think something might be behind it. I think of the great PhD astronomer Robert Jastrow. It's a famous quote. It's a long quote. I'm not going to give it all to you, but he ends it with this. He says, for the scientist who's lived by faith and the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He's about to conquer the highest peak, and as he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who've been sitting there for centuries. It's really interesting. Now, modern scientific observation can't account for things like meaning. I'm not going to spend time on this. Meaning, write that down. Or purpose. That's your next word, purpose. You get the idea. Now, do you see where we're going here? Okay? So here's the question. As a Christian, what should I do? What do I do? Number one, let me give you some tips. We'll be done. Ready? Number one, objectively go after truth. Remember, truth is a fixed point. Truth is an objective reality. Now, what I'm saying to you is be objective in your search. And I mean it. Take that where it leads you, but be objective about it. Guys, one of the things I have learned, truth is I'm not that smart. Truth is, you're looking at a high school dropout. Went and got my GED, went to college and all that, but I am gonna tell you, I've never been an academic. But over the years, I'm 51 years old, I have read book after book after book, and there's one thing that I have learned. everybody has an agenda. And when you're reading things that are so true, you've always got to ask, okay, why are they writing that? And that's why you just go and you say, okay, I'm gonna go check the sources objectively, check me. I'm gonna objectively go, and I'd say that to you, objectively go after truth. Don't be afraid of it. Now, again, spent a whole lot of time on truth. If you weren't here for that weekend, go back to it. But here's what I wanna say to you. Don't give in to fear. Can I tell you guys a secret? Sneak peek into my diary here. For years, I was a pastor, and I was so afraid of these kind of questions. So you know what I did out of my fear? I just dismissed them as, well, you shouldn't be asking those things. Maybe you're like me. Somebody would come to me with these kind of questions, and I would act like I knew, but I really didn't know. And I would kind of do that imposter syndrome thing, and I would move on. And for years, there was one book that I would never read, and it was an old book. I think it was in the 1800s by a guy named Bertrand Russell. And he wrote about why he's not a Christian. It's a famous book, and I remember I always wanted to read it, but I was too afraid to read it because I thought the moment I read it, I may lose my faith. Maybe you're there. So I never wanted to read this book. But friends, I'm gonna tell you something. That fear, here's what I've learned. One high school dropout to graduates, probably for most of you, it's a phantom. I finally got the courage to read that book, and I realized, oh my gosh, the questions aren't that hard after all. Wow, and there is a whole lot of evidence. See, this whole thing within the Christian world, don't explore, don't look, this kind of mentality, we're too afraid to peek under the hood for fear of what we might find. Do you know what it is, guys? How many of you have seen The Wizard of Oz? Come on, who's seen it? You guys are very intelligent people. This is what I'm saying. You have the power to put that to use. You've seen The Wizard of Oz? You remember how afraid they were of the wizard until what? You pull back the curtain, you see it's a guy about my size, old man, bald, he's just pulling the wires, and that's what it's like. People are afraid. People are afraid of doubt. Let me tell you what Christians are afraid of. Christians are afraid of doubt because you think that if you have doubt, well, God's not going to be happy with you. Well, don't you see you're trying to conjure a feeling again? Don't be afraid of doubt. Do you know that it's doubt that makes faith possible? If you had no doubt, all you would have is certainty. Doubt is what leaves room for faith. God's not gonna look at you and go, oh, because you have questions, that's a problem. God's gonna welcome the questions because he's God, he's not intimidated by your doubt. I would encourage you to start doubting your doubts. I would encourage you to speak to yourself more as you're listening to yourself. Many of us, we just listen to ourselves and do. Why don't you speak to yourself also? Proclaim some truths, go after it. But don't be afraid of doubt. Doubt is what enables trust. By the way, somebody asked, can a Christian be a scientist? I think it was John Polkinghorne, who was an amazing scientist. And by the way, he left the field of science after he had already cut ground and made a name for himself. He left science to become a priest. John Polkinghorne, he says, far from hindering the rise of modern science, faith in God is one of the things that drove modern science. See, doubt can be the gateway to better understanding. So here's the question. Moving quickly, here's the question. How do I know something is true? Well, here's what I'll say. First of all, it's a loaded question. You ask me, how can I know something is true? All I'm gonna say to you is you can't know, you can have trust. Not with the big questions. Not with the big questions, not when it comes to origin life. So what you can do is you can look at the evidence and you can take a faith position. And no matter what position you're gonna take, it's faith. Now, I would suggest asking yourself some questions about trust or truth. You ready? Here's the questions. Ask yourself, is this thing I believe logically consistent? Just ask yourself that. In other words, this thing that I believe, does it make sense of the world? Does it provide rational answers? This thing that I believe. Now, I look at the Christian faith and I think it really does. It's really reasonable. It makes sense of the world. It provides me with sane answers. It's not a leap of faith. Frankly, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist in my quest for truth. That is a bigger leap for me because it leaves too many things unanswered. Now, next, here's the next question. Is the thing that I believe empirically adequate? Meaning, is there hard evidence for it? Can I go back? And friends, this is why we keep taking you to Israel. I'll say it over and over again. Christianity is the only faith that is based in history. The Bible is a history book. When I say go study the history to understand the Bible, I say that because it is a history book. So you go and you study the context, and you look at why it was being written, what it was written for, who was it writing to. You get the idea, but you can check the fact. Is it empirical? By the way, I would say, I love being a Christian. I love being a Christian. You know why? Because I would say it is the most empirically adequate philosophy, theology, religion, you name the discipline, it has more evidence than anything else I've ever seen. So I once sat with another historian, and I'm not even a historian. He's a bona fide historian. And I said, look, we can debate this all you want, but you're going to have to admit to me, the Bible has more supporting documentation than any of the history you teach in school. He said, that I have to agree with, because it does. Finally, here's the last question. Is the thing I believe experientially relevant? Meaning, can I look at my own life experience and the life experience of others and go, man, yep, works out again. Yep, that seems to be the way it goes. Yep. And I'd say, now, I don't use any one of those questions, but I'll use all three of them to help me figure things out. God says, look, the psalmist writes in Psalm 28, no one who trusts in God will ever be disgraced. Disgrace does come to those who try and deceive others, but verse 4, he says, God, show me the right path. Lord, point out the road for me to follow. Lead me by your truth and teach me. And then I love Psalm, I think it's 86, where it says, teach me your ways, O Lord, that I may live according to your truth. Grant me purity of heart, my motives, so that I could honor you. Now, here's the next thing. It leads to this. Write this down. I won't spend much time on anything else here, but watch your motives. Just watch them. You know, here's what I've noticed over the years, pastor, and I've been at NorthPointe now for 19 years, and here's what I've noticed about the parade of people that come through from time to time. People will come to church and they will say, my life is falling apart and I want to believe in God. And usually it goes something like this. I need strength. My career is falling apart. My relationships are falling apart. Things are difficult. So they're coming to church. And by the way, I love it that you're here. Those are all good reasons. If you're going to go anywhere, come to church when you're going through those things. But they're saying, I need an experience of God so that I can have the life that I want. I want to say to you, in the psalm that we are looking at today, I want you to notice David's motives for seeking God. What's the context of this psalm? In most of your study Bibles, would you zoom in on this in this study Bible? In most of your study Bibles, it's going to show you a chapter, and it's going to give you the context of the chapter. Let's look at this one. What does it say? It says, a psalm of David when he was in the what? Wilderness in Judah, right? Why was he in the wilderness? Well, let me tell you. His son Absalom was trying to kill him. Imagine being your life threatened by your own child. So his son is trying to kill him. His son is trying to take over as king, and his life is totally at stake. But when he comes to God and he begins to pray, what does he say to God? Watch, he says, your love, O God, is better than my life. Even if I lose my life, God, your love is better than that. He says, my lips will glorify you. I will praise you as long as I live, and I lift up your name. I will lift up my hands. In other words, I'm going through a terrible time, but I still praise you. I still worship you. In other words, guys, look at me for just a moment. I say this as your pastor. Notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, Lord, I need strength in my life. I need my marriage saved, so would you show up? He doesn't say, Lord, I still want my kingdom, and I've been a good king, so I have this request. Give me my life. Save my life. He doesn't say that. What does he say? He says, God, your love is better than my life. My lips will glorify you. I will praise you as long as I live, and I will lift your name on high. In other words, he's saying, God, you are more important than anything going on. And when I say watch your motives, because let's jump back to transcendence. Some of you are here today and you're searching for something, and I want to tell you, if you stay in the place where, oh, I want God for what God can do for me, I'm going to tell you, you're going to get a transcendence fix, but then you're going to go away. You will not last. But if you can cross the threshold of saying, no matter what happens in my life, God, you're the most important thing. I love to love you. Now you're on your way to maturity. And you're gonna find what you're looking for. So what do? Write this down. Ask God for help. I love the psalm that we read today. On my bed, God, I remember you. I think of you through the watches of night because you are my help. I sing in the shadow of your wings. My soul clings to you. Your right hand upholds me. And then finally, write this down. Put away fear. Put away fear. Friend, God loves you. He has so much for you. Don't be afraid to seek it. How many of you have these little cups? Little communion cups? We have spent a whole series talking about how we can be the people that God has called us to be, and we've been dealing with some hard topics, but I'm gonna tell you this. The only reason you can seek the Lord is because of what he's done on the cross for you. I've said it before, it's not by works. Jesus paid your debt and my debt so that we could know him. And we're gonna take a moment online. If you're online, I encourage you, pause this, run to the kitchen, get some elements. I don't care if it's donuts and Dr. Pepper. Just go get something that represents the body and the blood of Jesus. You can tell I'm not very liturgical in my style, but I would just say, grab something that you can meaningfully connect with God on. And if you're in Kerman, if you're at Bullard, you're gonna do communion with us for just a minute. But here's what's important as we commit the things we've been studying to the Lord. Look at what it says. Paul writes this in Corinthians, if you'd go to this scripture for me. He says, he's writing to the church and he says, for I passed on to you what I received from the Lord himself. He says, on the night that Jesus was betrayed, the Lord Jesus took some bread and he gave thanks to God for it. And then he broke it and he said, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And they all ate this thing as a way of saying, Jesus, we don't want to forget you. And it was pre-going to the cross. Imagine Jesus' feelings about that. He knows he's about to suffer and die for you. He says, this is my body, which is broken for you, to pay for your sin so that you could be the person I've called you to be. Father, thank you for your broken body.